So with version 4 coming to a close, I decided to create a character tier list for Pre-Natlan. Now this is going to be a bit more meta-based, with the focus primarily centered around individual performance, as well as how they operate in their teams in floor 12 and also some 11 content at average investment. So here's the criteria for each of these tiers really quickly. So tier 0 are basically just like meta defining characters, pretty much characters that oftentimes define the current meta in BIS cycles. They're very powerful and versatile units and can fit in many team compositions. They typically excel in most, if not all, forms of content in the game, and will often dictate things like strategies or compositions that are most effective to clearing that content. Tier 0.5 is more of the influential meta characters. So they do have a significant influence on the meta, and while they may not define it all the time, they are often found in a lot of top tier team compositions and strategies. They also have very strong abilities and synergies that can greatly enhance a team's performance. Tier 1 characters are the meta relevant characters. So these are characters that are of course relevant to the meta. They may not be the most powerful or versatile characters compared to the other two tiers above them, but they do have unique abilities or things like roles that make them valuable in very specific team composition or strategy. And they're often used in combination with higher tier characters to maximize their effectiveness. Tier 1.5 characters are the compatible type characters. They can be effectively used in the current meta, but may require things like specific team comps or strategies especially to be useful. And they generally do have good abilities and can perform well in given situations or roles. Tier 2 are the situational characters. Now, these are characters that are of course situational in the current meta. They have decent abilities and can be used in certain compositions. However, they may struggle to perform consistently when it comes to different types of content. Tier 3 characters are the challenge characters that are challenged to be used effectively in the current meta. They do have very specific weaknesses or some limitations that do require them to use specific strategies or again team compositions to overcome that hurdle. Tier 4 are the limited characters that have very little relevance in the current meta, if any. They have some niches or certain use cases that can make them decent, but they typically do struggle to compete with higher tier characters when it comes to aspects like power or versatility. And then of course tier 5 is characters that are generally just considered irrelevant to the current meta. They have very significant weaknesses or limitations that make them problematic to invest and build into. And if you do decide to invest into these characters, it does require a substantial amount of investment, as well as very specific strategies to actually even make them effective. So now that's the criteria out the way. So when it comes to 5 stars, I'm ranking 5 stars at C0. 4-star characters that were released prior to Fontaine, I'll look at them at the lens of between C4 and C6, and characters released after Fontaine will be looked at from around C0 to C2. Alright, so starting with the lowest tier, which is the irrelevant tier, characters that I have personally listed are Chunghyun, Aloy, Amber, Hydro Traveler, and Kaveh. These 5 characters, just in general, you are rarely ever going to see someone unironically use them unless they're somebody that genuinely just loves them and will never not use them, which is a very small percentage of people, and even people who do love these characters. Sadly, we must admit that these characters just aren't that effective. Even when you try to input them in a specific niche, their kits just severely limit them to the point where it's just not worth building into. Of course, a character like Amber has super niche cases for like things like showcases or certain setups, but that also requires things like Elegy of the End. Overall, these characters just are not worth investing into, especially if you are trying to do something like clearing floor 12 content, and that is one of your primary objectives in the game. Next up is tier 4. So for tier 4, I have Fremine, Mika, Animo Traveler, Razor, Electro Traveler, Jinyan, Barba, Candice, Geo Traveler, Goro, and Yunjin. Now these characters are of course a lot more limited compared to the characters that are above them. They do have very specific cases where you can use them and they're okay, but for the most part what their kits have to offer are not necessarily the greatest. Like Fremine, for example, he is a physical focused character, and although he is able to be used in like Hyperbloom teams because of the fact that he has crowd application, generally speaking, when you're looking at his raw damage output and just what he has to offer, he doesn't offer a lot, especially when we're taking into consideration that we're looking at the lens of him at like C0 through C2. It's just not that effective. Mika is also a case where he had good intentions for what he wants to bring to the table, but what he actually brings isn't really a lot. He did get slightly better with Farina's release because of his burst healing, but even then, outside of that, everything else that his kit offers in terms of the attack speed and the physical damage bonus in some of his stuff, overall is rarely a benefit. Mika in and of himself kind of just overall isn't really the greatest. And then there's characters like Jinyan and Candice where they have a few situations where like it's justifiable to use them, but it's like it's really just not worth. Like Candice truthfully really needs C6 to even be considered usable, and even when she's considered usable, she struggles to compete with like any of the other characters that can fit in the same slots as her. across all team archetypes. And with Jinyan's case, although she does have her shield, and when you do get C2 plus and everything, she can be a decent character to use for something like Tenacity Bot with just her shield just constantly proccing the effect, but like she's not exclusive to that duty. I mean, there's a bunch of other characters that can also do that. So even outside of that, once you take that aspect away, she's kind of just there, and you would only really use her if you literally have nobody else to use for either like the shield replacement, or if you just don't have that wide of a selection of damage dealers, which you most likely do by this point in the game. Even for a newer player, you have at least probably 1 or 2 DPS characters that you could easily use over Jinyan. Now Goro, I'm actually double thinking putting him in tier 3, but I think the initial reason I put him in tier 4 is simply just the fact that even though he's purely a mono geo buffer and he's decent at what he does in that role, mono geo just in and of itself is kind of just whatever. It's a solid team, but it's nothing extraordinary or out of this world. But I think I might move him up to tier 3. I don't know. We'll put Goro in the tier 4 for now. I might reconsider putting him tier 3 later on, but I feel like tier 4 isn't like a horrible placement for him. Alright, so for tier 3 characters, so I have Qiqi, Sayu, Lynette, Kujusara, Dori, Klee, Dehya, Noelle, Ningguang, Dendro Traveler, and Kale. Now you'll be probably scratching your head because you're like, Qiqi, what the hell is Qiqi doing here? So the thing about Qiqi is, of course, she doesn't have particle generation in her skill. She suffers from that a lot. However, what she does offer is a really good amount of healing. And especially when you start to use her with Farina, that is actually going to be quite significant. Now, of course, when it comes to cryo-based teams with Farina, there's only so many varieties that you can do with that. But what Qiqi has to offer at a baseline of just offering a lot of healing is honestly not that bad. And of course, you can also do very unique and niche stuff. Like, for example, there was recently like a Skyward Blade thing with like Cloren that people discovered, which of course isn't the most optimal thing, but it clears, and it's also a fun team that players can interact with and have fun with, especially older players. I think there's a lot of these scenarios that Qiqi can be filled in that are actually pretty decent and make her not too bad of a unit to use. Of course, she's not always going to be the first unit that you want to use, but she's still solid though. For the case of a character like Dehya just suffers from mainly the fact that her DPS capabilities are very limited. I mean, they just consistently mess with her scalings, and instead of doing this beautiful thing called listening to player feedback, they just decided to slap some small numbers and call it a day. Just what they love to do with characters that are highly anticipated for some reason, and it just happened to, of course, be this one specifically. Crazy. And even as a support, she's a solid support. I mean, she has damage mitigation in her kit, so that's somewhat useful in some way. Can reliably trigger tenacity if you want her to use as like a tenacity bot. Can work as like a burgeon trigger, although her burgeon triggers are very slow because her skill only applies once every 2.5 seconds. So you're only looking at like 5 burgeon procs like per rotation, which isn't the greatest, but like something's better than nothing, I guess. And then you have characters like Noelle and Ningguang. Ningguang can actually work pretty well as sort of like a quick swappy type character, especially if you have somebody like Navia, for example, in the team. Can work pretty decently in that scenario. She also works fine as a construct enabler for a character like Chiori, and also offers some geo damage bonus when you go through the walls, so she has some support utility. And then for Noelle, she actually got a decent increase with Farina's release because of the fact that in her shielded state, she does actually heal the entire team through her normal attacks, so she can work as a healing driver in those teams, which is pretty nice. And then for Dendro teams, Dendro Traveler and Kale simply just act as alternatives when you don't have a character like Nahida or even like Yao Yao or Baiju. They just purely really act as alternatives, and they're not bad by any means. They're actually relatively decent. And they have some cases like Kale, for example, in Bloom can actually be really sufficient and one of the better Dendro options for application in certain scenarios. But for the most part, just on a baseline, you don't really opt to use these two unless you just don't have anybody else. And that's just the reality with how they work and how their kits are. But they are far from bad, truthfully. All right, in tier 2. So tier 2 we have, what is it? Kaya, Rosaria, Diona, Charlotte, Heijo, Farazan, Lisa, Sethos, Diluc, Yanfei, Yoimiya, Chavrus, Mona, and Albedo. Now we heard the Y name in there, Miss Yoimiya. Listen, I love my girl Yoimiya. Listen, I love her to death. She's so cute and she's so fun. Unfortunately though, I must admit that although I really wanted to put her in something like tier 1 or tier 1.5, I kind of have to face the reality that she just doesn't, she's not really getting better and better as patches go on. She's very restricted to single target content, which is one of the main issues that she has consistently had throughout her entire existence just as a character. The minute you take her outside of that scenario, her power just begins to diminish significantly. In addition to that, she has very specific normal attack strings that she wants to be vaping, where she wants to specifically vape hits like her first, third, and like her last normal attack hit, because they have really high multipliers and have generally the highest multipliers in her normal attack strings. And when you desync from that by either having to dodge enemy attacks, or if you get increased attack speed like from Mika for example, you can potentially desync your vape hits from that, and once they start deviating from that, she actually loses a considerable amount of damage, which isn't good, which makes it a little frustrating trying to optimally play Yoimiya when you have cases like that where you either have to desync your hits or your hits are just inherently desynced from certain external buffs, which makes it really unfortunate when trying to actually use her. Now, Setha's being here is actually pretty nice. Even at a C0 to C2 investment level, Setha's as an electro DPS honestly isn't too bad, especially when you're using him in things like Hyperbloom, for example. I found that not only is he more on the interactive side in terms of the DPS department, but him being Electro just enables him to play in Dendro teams very easily, because I mean that's just Electro kind of in a nutshell now at this point for the most part. I mean overall, he's just pretty solid. Kai and Rosaria and Diona, the Crow units, they're just generally situational. You can use them in things like melt teams. Diona, especially for like freeze teams, very nice defensive option that can be easily slotted in. Charlotte is also a decent defensive option too, although her thing especially makes her relevant to being a situational tier 2 unit is the fact that she has burst healing, and that strongly incentivizes you to want to use her with Farina, because once you take her outside Farina teams, her burst healing, although it's still good, because I mean, you know, healing's good still, but the benefit that you gain from that burst healing without somebody like Farina that can actually take advantage of it sort of diminishes. But still, it's nice that they offered a unit to where if you don't have any other burst heal, you can just use Charlotte simply for burst healing and can still capitalize on Farina. And of course, for Farazan's case, Farazan is just one of those characters where she's situational because of the fact that she's just purely an animo damage buffer, and she's a really good one at that, especially once you get higher constellations. Although the issue with her is that I don't know if using the word need is the proper term here, but I'm going to use it for this case anyways, because I'm someone who does actually play characters like Wander and like Heijo on field DPS. I noticed a large difference when I didn't have Farazan at C6 versus after I got her C6 recently after I got C1 Baiju. The difference is very noticeable, especially when I was able to switch my artifact build path from something like Emblem to Tenacity. The difference was honestly just night and day. So getting her C5 and C6 especially are pretty significant constellations, but like if you're someone who doesn't have C6, if you at least have her C2, then she's still worthwhile building because of the fact that her C2 extends her elemental burst duration, which is pretty nice. But yeah, having C5 and C6 are even like greater increases to what she has to offer for animo damage dealers. And lastly, I'll talk about Diluc. So Diluc's case is actually very interesting. I almost put him in tier 3, but then I remember the fact that Jianyin exists, which basically enables one of his better teams that actually performs really nice. This is because of the fact that Diluc's plunge attack scaling is I think the highest in the game, if I'm not mistaken. If not one of the highest, but I think it is the highest. And so Jianyin being able to enable him to do those plunge attacks, and if you have him in a team with like C6 Bennett and Farina especially, a really strong core team that is just honestly both fun and strong, which makes him have me put him in the like situational. So we're like, if you have these units together, then he can perform really strongly. But if you're not in a team that can enable his plunge attacks, then he's sort of just whatever. All right, for tier 1.5, so getting higher into these tiers. So for 1.5, we have Ganyu, Eula, Layla, Jin, Beidou, Toma, Gaming, Ayato, Sijuin, Ito, Chiori, Yayao, Kirara, and Tainari. All right, so starting with the crowd girlies. So the cases with Ganyu, Eula, especially for the DPS department, the reason why I especially didn't put Ganyu in tier 1 is just that compared to Ayaka, she's only just slightly worse, although not significantly worse. It's like slightly worse. The advantage that she does have over Ayaka, for example, is kind of the fact that she can also be played in that sub DPS role, and she does have her new stuff where she can do things like burn melt reliably, but it just comes down to the fact that compared to Ayaka in her best team, compared to Ganyu in her best team, Ayaka just simply does more. I mean, which isn't inherently a bad thing. I mean, it's just what happens with units that are newer and stuff. But Ganyu performs well still in freeze, and especially if you have something like Venti and you can do the permafrost team, it's still a really strong team. For Eula's case, she's also still a decent DPS, although because she is physical, her rating is a little bit lower. Also the fact that you do need a sufficient battery to be able to use Eula's burst every rotation. And right now, her support department is kind of interesting because Miko was kind of supposed to be that physical support for him, but then didn't actually end up really being a great one for her. Like, he's still usable, especially if you're opting something like Farina, but realistically outside of that, what Mika has to offer for Eula is only like at most a minor upgrade, but it's nothing significant to where it's worth building Mika for Eula straight up. But like Eula's still fine. I mean, she has her nuke damage and like she's still strong. So like she's not like completely bad. For a character like Jean in this tier, Jean got a massive buff thanks to Farina, and she's now seen some play in a decent variety of teams with Farina, especially because she's an animal unit, can proc VV, has healing, and especially if you have her at higher constellations like C2 and C4, works really well with animo damage dealers or characters that benefit from attack speed buffs like Wanderer, for example, especially, gains a really nice increase in that department. She's overall just a more stable unit now. For a character like Ayato's issue, I love Ayato, but the reason why he's not tier 1 is because although he's a flexible character, he's unfortunately, like we all can understand from this character, he's kind of just a jack of all trades, but doesn't really excel in any one particular thing. He's just like that unit to where if you just want to play a random Hydra unit that works on field, you can do it with him, but otherwise, I mean, Nuvalet's release kind of just put him in the gutter, to be honest, and now Ayato's, I guess, quote-unquote best team, or team where he is more competitive, is rather in like a Bloom-based team, and specifically just a strict Bloom team. But even then, I mean, he's sort of just okay, which isn't a bad thing, but that's just why he's in 1.5. It's just that he's purely just okay. Now, although I haven't seen too much about Seedrine, and honestly, I just know that she does healing and I think offers a skill damage buff. So this is purely more just a guess on my end, rather than like a full-blown estimation from genuine understanding of her. But she just seems like an alternative rather than a character that you would prioritize getting. I don't know, just from what I've seen of her, she just doesn't stand out that much to me, if that makes sense. That's just how I feel about her. She seems like an alternative to where if you don't have somebody else that can consolidate that healer role like she does, then she's a fine pickup, but otherwise it's not really worth your Primo Gems to go all out on her unless you just really love her design, which her design is cute. She has a really cutesy design. I actually love her design a lot. But I wouldn't personally pull for her because I already have a decent selection of healers in my inventory. For the case of a character like Chiori, I mean, Chiori just offers a lot of damage, and especially when compared to Albedo, even when she only has a one doll, she still at least does a similar amount of damage to Albedo, and only loses out to him in very specific cases like certain reaction-based teams because Albedo offers the Elemental Mastery bonus. But realistically, outside of that, I mean, she's generally just a strict upgrade to him, especially when she gets that second doll. Literally does double his damage. I mean, Chiori just offers damage, which, I mean, for a sub DPS, it's whatever. And then for a case like Yaya and Kirawa, who are defensive utility options in Dendro teams, Yaya offers decent off-field healing for the active character, can also do some burst healing, although of course it's in her elemental burst, which does require some field time, which is a little bit unfortunate, but you won't really have many cases where you have to do it every single rotation unless you're taking a lot of damage in your fights, which can happen with recent floors, so it is going to be a bit more of a prevalent issue as time goes on because enemies are becoming more deadly, so you might have to. But for the most part, from just my actual experience using Yayao, I've noticed that oftentimes I tend to use her burst every other rotation more often than not, rather than having to use it every rotation unless I really just felt like I needed to get that healing like now or else like my characters are gonna die. And her burst healing is really sufficient too. Although the issue with her healing is the fact that it's not too compatible with Farina because of the fact that most of her healing comes from her off-field healing from an elemental skill. And so if you are using Farina, then you do have to actually then start building energy to burst every rotation so that you can capitalize on fanfare. And then Kirawa is just a stable shielder. And I mean, even in teams that aren't super centered around Dendro reactions, she just offers a decent amount of shielding just in general, which is pretty nice for a 4-star character. Alright, in tier 1, we have Risley, Ayaka, Shenhe, Sucrose, Venti, Zhao, Wanderer, Jianyan, Clarin, Kaching, Sino, Yamiko, Child, Kokomi, and Nilu. So the thing about Risley and Ayaka, they're very stable crowd DPS units. Risley fits more in sort of that melt archetype for his damage output, as that's where a lot of his better teams tend to be. He can still work in freeze pretty decently because, I mean, he's just an on-field crowd applicator DPS, so he can still work in freeze. Just that his higher damage potential tends to be in the melt teams because he is a normal attack-based character, rather than someone like Ayaka that consolidates a lot of their power into their elemental burst. And of course with Ayaka, I mean, she's a staple freeze DPS. Offers a lot of damage in her burst, decent amount of damage in her skill, and can do normal attacks that are infused with cryo in the in-between periods of rotations to make up for the cooldowns. Overall, just a staple unit. Sucrose and Venti are in a similar tier, mainly because, at least for Venti's case, he does suffer from the fact that when you are not in content that his elemental burst can benefit from, he does lose a slight amount of power, but even then, just what he has to offer kind of at a baseline, especially the energy restoration for the particular element that he swirls, makes him a very comfortable unit to use. And for the case of Sucrose, Sucrose works well, especially when she can work as a driver in teams and play on field a little bit more. And even in teams where she's off field more, she still offers that elemental mastery buff, which is nice, especially in things like Dendro teams. And then for DPS units like Xiao especially, Xiao definitely got an increase with the release of a character like Genshin, who specifically buffs plunge attack damage. So when you put him in a team like him, Farazan, Genshin, and then like Farina, Genshin offers that burst healing and that healing over time. Also the plunge attack buff, Farina offers that damage % buff, and Farazan offers animo damage bonus, has a really strong core team at a baseline. Now Cloran is the most recent 5-star that they have released. Of course, Seedwin is coming this next patch after. As I'm recording this video, it's currently phase 1 of 4.7. For the case of Cloran, Cloran is just a solid electro DPS. She's like honestly nothing to brag home about, which isn't a bad thing though. Like she's a good DPS unit for the electro slot, works really well in things like Aggravate and Quick Bloom teams, but if you take her out of those teams and you don't have something like a super high invested Chevreuse that isn't like C6 or anything, or if you're trying to use her in like a Taylor team, although they work in their specific scenarios, it's definitely not as potent. And I mean, she just kind of suffers from just being, an electro on-field DPS. With the release of Dendro, they're not restricted to Dendro, but it's definitely notable that Dendro often becomes their better team archetypes compared to others. But so overall, she has a lot of DPS to offer. She's also a relatively comfortable unit to use, although she does have some minor skill issue moments here and there because of the way that her dash mechanic works. Keqing and Sino are kind of in a similar boat. Keqing especially got a nice boost when Dendro came out, and she can now be pretty good in things like Aggravate teams, especially because she's a more quick swappy type unit. And for the case of Sino, he's more on the hyper carry side. He likes to have a lot of dedicated on field time, and with the release of a character like Farina especially, he gained a lot of power, and he gained a nice core team of like him, Farina, Baiju, and then like either a second Dendro or a second Electro at your disposal depending on the scenario. Really strong core team that makes his power a little higher than when he was at release. And then for Hydro, especially the case of Nilou is honestly just a Bloom enabler and basically is the identity of Bloom teams in a nutshell, which automatically kind of puts her in the tier 1 because she is relevant, especially in content where she can make use of Bloom. But once you start getting to more single target scenarios, then her power falls off because Bloom is notably reliant on having a little bit of AoE, so that way you can trigger more Bloom cores and then thus continuously do more and more Bloom over rotations. So that is her primary downside. And they have healers like Kokomi. Now I did consider putting Kokomi in 0.5 and I might do that later on, I don't know. It's just that to me, she's relevant, she's solid, and she's nice. She can act both as a healer but also as an on-field driver, especially if you're playing her in like a mono Hydro Farina team with like her Farina, a third Hydro, and then like Kazuha or something. Works amazing as the on-field driver in a team like that because of the way that she can heal the entire team through her normal attacks in her elemental burst state, but also offers active character healing that works well in like freeze teams alongside her Hydro application in her Jellyfish. She's overall just a staple unit. Honestly, now that I've explained it, I might honestly move her up to tier 0.5. But I'll move her to tier 0.5 for now. I hope that's a valid enough reason. I'm just gonna keep her in tier 0.5 now, because I think after I started explaining it, I kind of realized that she does actually offer a decent amount, which I think does make her relatively influential as a Hydro healer. Alright, now on to the other tier 0.5 units. So here in this tier we have Fischl, Raiden Shogun, Kuki Shinobu, Hu Tao, Xiangling, Lini, Arlecchino, Navia, Zhongli, Alhaitham, and Baiju. Fischl is just a staple off-field electro DPS unit, works as an amazing battery for on-field DPS units that are also electro, offers a nice amount of damage, especially with the release of Dendro, gain a significant boost of damage like with most of the electro units, if not all of them. And on top of that, she also got a nice buff with the release of the Golden Troop set. Fischl just honestly keeps winning, and especially when you take into account things like her C6 off-field triggers, alongside her passive effects, she's overall a staple off-field electro DPS unit, and you can't go wrong with using her, honestly. Raiden Shogun as a main DPS at C0, if I was ranking it as a main DPS, she would be more like in tier 1, but because we're encapsulating their overall identity as well as how they can work in different roles, she fits a bit more in the tier 0.5 because she can actually work well as a support, especially as a Hyper Bloom trigger. And even outside of supportive roles, she works decently well as sort of like a quick swappy burst DPS type, which is more so leaning towards her main DPS playstyle. She can also act as sort of like a tenacity bot. She has different ways that she can work in teams, and generally just offers a lot of flexibility and also a little bit of energy for these teams, which makes her a pretty relevant unit. Now Kuki is 0.5 because she's actually pretty relevant, And I say this because I'm a person who plays Hyperbloom quite a bit. When I didn't have Kukishinobu, it's like night and day when you don't use Kukishinobu in Hyperbloom, or if you don't have Raiden Shogun for Hyperbloom. It's pretty noticeable. And Kuki simply being a 4-star unit that can easily trigger Hyperbloom cores from off field and also heal the active character makes it really nice. And something to note is that I think it's her C6. Once she reaches a certain threshold, she also gains additional elemental mastery for a duration, which passively also increases Hyperbloom damage. She's overall just a stable unit that can offer off-field application and healing that works really well in these teams. And for the power DPSs like Hu Tao, Xiangling, and Lin and Arlecchino, all these 4 are honestly just very prevalent and very strong. The reason why, especially for Xiangling, that I didn't put her in tier 0 though, is because she is reliant on a character like Bennett to buff her and give her attack buffs. Of course, there are scenarios that you don't have to play her with Bennett, like for example, more specifically in like a Chevreuse overload team, because Chevreuse actually generates a decent amount of particles for Xiangling, and thus she can also work as a battery for her. But generally speaking, Xiangling does need a battery because of the fact that she does have an 80 energy cost. Her elemental skill only generates 4 particles, and you're typically only using 1 skill every rotation for the most part. So she does need a decent amount of batterying and energy just in general to be sufficient, which honestly isn't exclusive to just Xiangling. Works like the same way with like every other character that needs 80 energy to burst every rotation. But it's more especially the case with Xiangling because of the fact that more often than not, she's only doing 1 skill per rotation. Navia is a very strong Geo DPS unit. It's more so just the fact that she offers a ton of front-loaded damage. It's like a lot, especially when you can consistently get 5 and even max stacks on her crystal shots. Offers a ton of front-loaded damage, and alongside that, her normal attack damage is actually pretty decent in her infusion state. She's really just a strong character in general when you put her in good teams. Zhongli is just a staple shield unit. Literally, you pop the shield and you're pretty much immune to most aspects of the game. Of course, he did get passively nerfed with the introduction of certain enemies, especially enemies that apply Bond of Life and Fontaine, you know, like the husks that also do passive HP drain through the corrosion effect. So there are little things like that that Hoyoverse has made sure to implement to where you can't just use Zhongli to nullify every single form of content. Kind of a similar thing that they did with Venti, where they made some enemies not as susceptible to crowd control. Same case with Zhongli, cannot nullify all forms of content, but he's still a staple character that can provide a ton of interruption resistance in his elemental shield, alongside offering a resistance shred. For Dendro, there's of course Alhaitham and Baizhu. Baizhu is a really great healer. I don't know why so many people slept on him on his release. I was actually somebody that was a big proponent and fan of Baizhu, although I don't think I really spoke about it on like YouTube or anything. I was mostly just talking about it with friends and close people. But I was like a really big supporter of Baizhu, and like I knew that he was a good unit all the way back when he was released because of the fact that not only does he offer healing, but the way that he offers healing is so easy and comfortable to use. And I feel like comfort is a factor that can honestly go understated sometimes. People don't really acknowledge the fact that comfort can go a long way with the ease of ability to perform floor 12 content especially. And now with the release of Farina, this difference between characters like him and like Yao Yao, for example, become more starking because you start to realize that being able to just press the elemental skill button to offer team-wide healing and effectively gain almost all your fanfare stacks in 1 skill press and then like a burst press maybe every once in a while is very different to where you have to swap in and spend on-field time to burst heal with a character like Yao Yao, and then also probably have to invest energy to burst every single rotation. It's minor differences like that that really do make a notable difference when you're comparing their performance in floor 12 content. Now, of course, pre-Farina, they were a little bit more comparable, especially in something like spread teams, where Yao Yao can sometimes outperform Baizhu because of her C1's netto damage bonus. But on a general baseline, I mean, Baizhu was always just a good unit. And now with Farina, I mean, his power level just increased exponentially, to be honest. And for the case of Alhaitham, now the thing about Alhaitham that needs to be pointed out is that a lot of his power is not purely just from his own DPS. When you compare his own DPS to damage that comes from Hyperbloom cores, let's be honest, a lot more of the damage in his better teams, especially like the Hyperbloom teams, does come from the Hyperbloom cores. However, in Quick Bloom teams, he does get the chance to perform more spread damage, which does also mean that his DPS then starts to be either equivalent or slightly higher than the Hyperbloom damage. But it's more so just the fact that the teams that he plays in are really strong, and then he also offers on-field application and damage output, which further enhances that. Alright, and lastly, we have the Tier 0 characters. Now these are the definite meta-defining characters, and honestly you're probably going to see these characters in like almost every team composition whenever somebody has the chance to put them in. So for these characters, there is Kazuha, Bennett, Neuvillette, Farina, Zincho, Yelan, and Nahida. Kazuha is purely meta defining because of the fact that he has a lot of ease of accessibility to crowd control, has the ability to just press his elemental skill for quick crowd control, or if you need a little bit stronger suction, then he has his hold skill as well. His elemental burst applies application off field and offers some damage over time. And he has the ability to do things like double swirling a lot more reliably compared to other characters because of the way that his abilities work, and also offers a damage percent bonus that strictly scales off his elemental mastery, which is really nice buff, especially in mono element teams. He's overall just an amazing animo unit. Bennett is mainly up here, especially for the case of attack scalers. He's a really big boost to attack scalers. He literally can get attack scalers who typically have 2300 or 2200 like normal total attack and literally boost it up to like 3k, 3.1k, 3.2k, etc, etc. He offers a large flat attack boost, and he also plays the pseudo role of a healer because he does heal at a certain HP threshold. So being able to offer both defensive and offensive utility is really nice. Now, of course, his main downside is of course the fact that he only buffs attack scalers, so when you're trying to use him with a scaler like say Neuvillette that only scales with HP, then his power kind of just is irrelevant. But honestly, that's fine. He doesn't need to be in every single team to be purely meta defining. I think for what he has to offer, he's still a unit to where if you get him C1, which is really easy to get in like maybe a month or two, even like a couple months, you unlock pretty much the vast majority of his power, and then as you get more and more constellations, his power just begins to grow more and more. For the case of characters like Neuvillette and Farina, Neuvillette is just, he's like just in another world. It's more so just the fact that the way that he does his damage is so easy. You press the skill button, you hold the charge attack button, and water cannon, and you just splash water in an AoE. Now, of course, his single target damage performance begins to be more comparable to characters like Hu Tao especially, who are a lot more single target oriented. However, he still matches them sometimes, although tends to perform a little bit worse. But literally the minute that you get into AoE content with 2, 3, and more enemies, the difference is just night and day. He does so much damage, and the way that he does his damage is in such an easy manner that it's almost laughable, honestly. For a character like Farina, Farina is just a nice buffer, offers a lot of damage percent buff, especially once you invest more levels into her elemental burst talent. Also offers a lot of skill damage too. Her skill damage is actually quite significant as well. Now, of course, her main thing is that especially prior to getting her C2, she is reliant on a healer to be able to completely maximize on her fanfare. But if you do have DPS characters that have HP manipulation in their kit inherently, like Neuvillette, Lenny, for example, then having a healer is not as necessary as they can generate a decent amount of fanfare on their own, and thus you can use solo healers more reliably. And even in situations where she's not generating as much fanfare with a solo healer, as long as the solo healer applies a decent amount of utility, like for example Bennett with its flat attack buff, or like a Shinobu with her ability to trigger Hyperbloom cores, then honestly it's justifiable to use those characters still in tandem with Farina. For Zincho and Yelan, they're honestly just two characters that go hand in hand together, work really amazing together, but also can work fine as the solo Hydra unit depending on the scenario. Zincho tends to be the better option in cases where his defensive utility is heavily prioritized, or if you just need more application. Whereas with Yelan, Yelan is the character that you go to for higher damage potential, as she does offer more straight up damage than Zincho even when he's like C6. And she also has that damage ramping buff that she has for the active character during her elemental burst duration, which again offers slightly higher damage potential in teams. And I mean, these two units, I mean, even when you use them alone, they're also really great when you use them together. Having both that defensive utility and that extra offensive damage increase is a really nice pairing to have. And then for Dendro teams, Nahida is the identity of Dendro teams. The way that she consolidates her Dendro application is very easy. You literally press her elemental skill or hold her elemental skill button. You can literally just sweep it in an AoE and do a quick 360 and boom. You have Dendro application for as long as you need. Her elemental burst also offers a lot of extra elemental mastery for the active character, which is especially nice for DPS characters that prioritize elemental mastery like Sino or Clorin in like Quick Bloom teams, or like I'll Hate Them. And then alongside that, she also gains a lot of additional buffs for herself with elemental mastery scaling, especially for her Trichoma Purification procs in her elemental skill. And she also offers a decent amount of damage from her elemental skill because of that. And overall, her strong Dendro application makes her ability to be used in pretty much every Dendro archetype, even like cases where the Dendro reaction isn't even like the main damage thing, like for example like Burn Melt teams. Her application just enables burning to be consistently procced, so that way the crowd DPS character can consistently melt over rotations, her ability to have niche cases like that as well make her a really nice unit in general for pretty much every Denjo based team that you want to play. Alright, and that concludes this tier list video. This was a very long video. This was like twice as long as my other one because I did decide to give some explanation that was a little bit more in depth compared to my last tier list, so hopefully my reasonings were valid. If you have slightly different opinions about certain characters and their placement, then leave them down in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Of course, be respectful when we're having discussions. There's no need to get mad or rage at anybody for having an opinion. At the end of the day, tier lists are, although people can try to be as objective as possible like I do, realistically there is some level of subjectivity and bias when placing certain characters in tiers. So don't be upset if somebody just has a character that they prioritize or view as better than some of the other ones placed here. Everybody has the right to their own opinion, so don't be weird about it in discussions, please. Alright, and take care, and until the next video, bye-bye.